Hey, welcome to Little Book Stories. This is a limited 10 episode series in my podcast and YouTube channel that is dedicated to the 10 chapters of my little book of Big Reasons to Love America. So there's a chapter dedicated to something, then it overflows with stories, additional nuance in these episodes, sort of stream of consciousness, completely unedited stuff, right? I hope you like it. And maybe you bumped into this on my YouTube channel or episode in my podcast and you want to read the book, which is awesome. Buy one book, buy an extra book for your friend. Today, this episode is dedicated to chapter 7, which talks about generosity and almost like this baseline generosity in America, but also how it affected me both from a distance and how I sort of adjusting my cultural baseline to being a generous person, a philanthropic person, how that changed my life as well. I'll talk about it in more detail in this episode. Welcome. Let's go. Hey, if you enjoy my podcast, you're going to love my weekly newsletter. Every week, I share strategies for success and significance because, let's be honest, who doesn't want both? We're talking life-changing wisdom that has transformed my life and the lives of people I've coached all over the world. You can start with the free version, but if you upgrade to the paid version, you'll unlock exclusive perks like early access to my monthly webinars, interviews with top experts, and even a signed copy of my book. Subscribe at christianrayflores.com. Your future self will thank you. So I grew up most of my life poor by American standards, basically. And two things shifted in me as I became a Christian. I sort of really had a softening of the heart, a more compassionate demeanor about me. I started meeting people who are just serving the poor. And I'm like, you can do that? So that's one thing. So I met some people that were particularly generous. And the main guy who really influenced me and inspired me, he was an American guy, right? And the second thing is I was in show business and I sort of had a platform all of a sudden. I had influence. I had the ability to spread the word, to bring attention to a cause. And I had watched this thing in the I think it was in the early 90s or late 80s called We Are the World and Band Aid. So there were two initiatives by musicians. One was Band Aid, which is in Great Britain, that was dedicated to musicians writing a song and doing a big show and campaigning to get help to people that are starving, I think in Ethiopia at the time. And that was just mind blowing to me. I was like, oh my gosh, they had the great song. Do They Know It's Christmas Time? If you want to look it up, it's fantastic. And the top people of Great Britain and sort of adjacent places were there. And then they did this massive concert on Wembley Stadium. And of course, it was just epic, okay? It was Queen and all kinds of amazing people there. And it was just, I think, billions of people for the first time, probably ever, on television, watching it at the same time. They raised a whole bunch of money for to relieve poverty in Africa, hunger, I think specifically in Ethiopia. So the Americans saw that, and I think it was Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson, and Lionel Richie got together and said, we should do something like that. And they came up with a song called We Are the World. And We Are the World, look it up, is, of course, epic as well. Now, they didn't have the stadium thing, but they did record a song. I think it was like 35 to 40 of the most gifted people on the planet, singers, musicians, etc. Like, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Michael Jackson. The list goes on and on. Cyndi Lauper. The list goes on and on. And the whole thing was orchestrated by the master producer. His name's Quincy Jones. He actually passed just recently, who is just one of the top producers in modern music history. Now, I watched this as I was sort of developing a budding music career, and I was like, man, I want to be like them, right? So when I became a popular artist, I wanted to do something like that. And I happened to become a Christian at the time. I meet this guy, his name's Sean Wooden, who was heading up this charity. And I was just inspired, and I wanted to do what he was doing, and I wanted to use my platform. So we started working with orphans, and it was just amazing because it was both sort of large scale. We would do these music and sports festivals for like 3,000 orphans or so in big places, and we would just bust them in from all over the city and they would just have a blast all day long. They would have games and sports competitions and awards, and then in the evening they would have this big gala concert. And of course, I brought my celebrity friends. I performed there as well, and they just loved it, right? But also, it was not only large scale, but it was also one-to-one, right, heart to heart. We would go to these orphanages. I went to this specific orphanage over and over again because I wanted to get to know the kids. And we would come and we would just either hang out, and I would hear their stories. And I will never forget. Of course, I heard tons of stories that were just heartbreaking. And it's just amazing to be in the presence of kids who just didn't get a lot of breaks in life, right? So this one girl I met, I said, "Hey, so why are you here?" And she goes, "Well, my dad's in prison." Okay, and she must have been like 8 or something like that. And she says, and I said, "Oh, so where's your mom?" And she goes, "Well, my dad is in prison because he killed my mom." And I just don't even know what to say to somebody like that, right? So her whole world, her perception of family, parenthood, all of that is shattered. And she has the sort of room and board, right, by the government. They were well provided for. They were not hungry. The orphanage was clean. They were taken care of physically, but emotionally, they needed connection. They needed friends. They need somebody to be there, not just because it's their job, but because they want to be there. And we became those people. So we would visit. And of course, for them, it was an extra bonus that I was on television at the same time. And they saw me just hang out with them and just spend time with them. And at one point, I even brought a couple of horses to the orphanage, and I would give them horse rides around the orphanage. It was so much fun. They just loved it. And we would perform for them. And then I had dancers, and they teach them some moves. And my wife, Deb, they love Americans, right? So, and she's American. So she would come and say, "I will teach you how to make chocolate chip cookies." And they were just over the moon and things like that. So we did a lot of that, and we developed relationships, and we did these big shows. And it really changed my heart, right? It became this massive shift. And I realized that, I grew up in places with poverty, and then also extreme poverty, like the Soviet Union during Soviet times, very, very poor. Extreme poverty, like subsistence level poverty, Africa. And I wasn't immersed in a culture where people would say, "Well, there's this problem. We're going to personally go and solve this," right? And I found that sort of the Western mindset, the Western civilization would be sort of this broad umbrella, had this almost like embedded culture. There's a quote from, not a quote, but sort of a note from this French historian. His name is Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm butchering his name. I apologize. And he wrote this book called Democracy in America. It was published in 1835, and he basically says that Americans have this propensity to form associations to address social issues. So there's a cultural thing that happened there. And it must have been born from, I would say, faith, the faith layer, which prioritizes serving the poor, but also probably a lot of immigrants taking care of each other because they didn't have any other structures sort of to protect them or help them sort of not fall through the cracks, right? So it's probably a combination of things. But I noticed that the America is extremely generous as a culture. And then there's this tradition of public-private partnerships, right? So in Europe, 100% people expect charity to be the domain of the state. It's not my business. It's not my responsibility. It's not my moral responsibility. It's mostly the state. The state needs to do this and this and this. This is why I pay taxes. So the culture is very different in America. In America, people feel personally obligated. It's their privilege to serve and donate to churches, to charities, to personally serve in some sort of capacity in a soup kitchen or go to like a mission trip. It's so normal in America to do so, and it's actually not normal in most other places. And I find that to be tremendously inspiring, and I think it's transformative for the nation as well. The other thing that I notice is that business, because this is true and normal for individuals, it's also true and normal for businesses, even large businesses, there's a long tradition of extreme rich people to create, foundations that support museums for decades and decades, scholarships for the arts, all kinds of things that are really philanthropic things. It's a long-standing tradition, and the modern expression of that is sort of the Giving Pledge. So a bunch of ultra-wealthy people came together, and it became a movement, actually, of the Giving Pledge. And the Giving Pledge of the ultra-wealthy has become sort of this essentially group of people or a community. You could say that the minimum you commit to giving away in your lifetime is 50% of all of your wealth, which is pretty impressive. There's billionaires in that club, essentially. And many of them, some of them, maybe many of them actually, not just some of them, are planning to give away like 90% or more of their total wealth to a cause that they believe in. That is really, really interesting. Now, even the state, even though, there's no negative news, but there's a positive news, positive news don't stick, they don't spread as much. But when I came to the States, I was 20 years ago, I worked on a grant, which was part of a larger collection of grants that were given by the government. And they were amazing grants, we did amazing work in the poor areas of the United States. And this was sort of a national grant. But there was another grant that I found out about because I'm interested in Africa because I grew up there, called the PEPFAR grant, the PEPFAR initiative, I think. And it was initiated by George W. Bush. Now, you might, regardless of your politics, right, if you think about it, did you know that under the presidency of George W. Bush, there was a PEPFAR program? Most people have no idea. And the thing is, this was initiated as a response to HIV/AIDS, right? And the HIV/AIDS was a massive epidemic, and it still is actually a significant factor in Africa. But the PEPFAR program literally saved, millions and millions and millions and millions of lives in Africa. And it was initiated by the United States government. People don't know that, regardless of your politics. You don't know that, But my point is, America is a very generous country on a state level, on a sort of government level, on a federal level, on a big business level, on a personal level. It's a very charitable culture. So I sort of caught that spirit and that culture from a distance originally, and then we moved to the United States. Oh, and before I forget, I think I already told this story in previous episodes, but it's a fun story. When we did these festivals for orphans, I was hanging out with my buddy Sean, who was sort of the head guy of this organization. And I said, there's Michael Jackson's coming to town. He's doing this massive stadium show. And I wonder if we time the festival to his coming, maybe we can reach out to him. And it's like a pipe dream, right? It's an impossible thing. And we did. So we somehow found who to reach out to in his extensive crew, and they basically expressed an interest because we knew that Michael was interested in causes for children and things like that. And until the last minute, we didn't know. We didn't know if he's going to come or not. And I remember being there, and of course, the whole thing is, it's happening. There's hundreds of volunteers, thousands of kids. And we're on the walkie-talkies, and we're going back and forth. Is he here? Is he going to come? They never tell you for sure. They say, well, if he's in the mood, he's going to come, basically. And all of a sudden, we hear he's coming. And of course, we actually none of the kids knew he was coming, right? 'Cause we didn't want him to be disappointed if he didn't. But we gave him like Michael Jackson songs to do dances to, right? So they prepared those, and they didn't know what the connection was. So he comes in with a little entourage, actually not a huge entourage. It was maybe, 6, 7 people, 2 or 3 friends, and then maybe 4 or 5 bodyguards, something like that. So it was actually quite tame. It wasn't like over the top. And I remember he came, and of course, I grew up in the third world where I didn't even have access to Michael Jackson albums. I would have to like ask for favors or make a copy on a cassette. I was so separated from that reality, even from the reality of seeing him live somewhere on and all of a sudden he's like 3 feet away from me. And I was just freaking out quietly, you know. And he came and he was smiling. He loved the dance of the kids. He just had fun and stayed for, I don't know how long he stayed for. I want to say maybe 45 minutes, an hour, something like that. And then he had to go. And right before he left, I realized that I'm about to. They start telling me, "Hey, you're about to go on stage and perform for these kids." And it dawned on me that, oh my gosh, I think I'm going to perform in front of Michael Jackson. And I was just frozen, just with fear. Like, I just can't imagine. And at the time, I was like, I can't offend him with my sort of amateurish performance compared to him. Of course, I'm a big star there, so for the kids, this is awesome. And but in my mind, I just wasn't worthy, right, to perform in front of him. And he left right before I came on stage, maybe like 15 minutes before, and I was so relieved, so relieved. And then the other story was that his crew liked our volunteers so much and how things were run that they actually asked for us to find them extras for the show, the stadium show. And he has this big song called the Earth Song, and I think they needed a few like middle-aged women or something like that. And then my mom was in that crew, so she said yes. And then the day off, I think she was calling me, saying, I have a headache, I don't want to go. And I'm like, you're saying no to being on stage with Michael Jackson in front of 80,000 people. You're going, I don't care about your headache. So I sort of talked her into it. And she was on stage with Michael Jackson in front of 80,000 people. And it was epic. And I couldn't even be backstage with her. And I really wanted sort of that all access pass. But I was going on tour myself. So I literally I was in the main sort of auditorium, and I couldn't even watch the whole show because I was going to go to the airport from there. Like, my bags are in the car. But I brought my whole crew, and it was just, of course, this epic show. And so that's my Michael Jackson story. So cool. And this is sort of a sidebar, right, from generosity. But, when we moved to the States, it became a big part of my life because I had sort of, it's sort of, I can't really pull it out of my heart, right? Service to the poor was so fulfilling. It felt like a must and not a non-optional thing. And one of the first jobs I got in the United States when I moved 20 years ago was I was sort of VP director for Latin America, like projects in 9 different countries. And we had clinics, after school programs, dental clinics in 9 different countries. And also I had the Positive Choice program, which is a multimedia program that was essentially teaching kids in inner city communities that had sort of dysfunctional families and things like that, how to healthy sexuality, basically. That's what it was, right? And it was so cool because I don't know how they hired me, because the learning curve was just insane. I was going all over the country to these big conferences and rubbing shoulders with pretty important people. I'm like, what am I doing here? But the program actually was super successful. Got a Telly Award. I have some awards here behind me. Like, one of those at the top shelf is 2 awards for the Positive Choice program. And we got a whole bunch more from other projects from a multimedia company. Eventually, this was later, because it had a multimedia thing with a guy, his name is Sean Holland, who was a star in Clueless. And he was the MC, and it was really cool, a virtual set. It was super entertaining. The kids loved it. And we sort of created this system that sent like peer educators to inner city, and they would just hang out with the kids and teach them stuff and play games. And that program was very successful and got some awards, and also was adopted eventually in places like Mexico, Jamaica, and then I heard that it was adopted in some other like Asian countries. And it was so fun to be part of that as sort of the main guy, right? The guy who organized it all. And of course, I had an amazing team, all kinds of very talented people that were more talented than I was in this. But it was just an incredible, almost like immersive introduction to America and the poorest parts of America, right? We would go into neighborhoods where, we couldn't stay after dark because, you could hear gunshots every night, right? So I got to see the real America, both from middle class, wealthy, and extremely poor. And then we would go to places like really dangerous places in Mexico and Jamaica and Guatemala and Honduras and also, Chile, Brazil, places like that. We'd go to the favelas. So it was just an incredible experience for me, and it had a deep imprint in my heart that, if more people knew what the problems were, if we knew how to solve them, those of us who have been blessed with functional families, character, education, some funds, we can help a lot of people, right? So anyway, that became sort of this non-negotiable part of my life. That's what I did professionally for a few years. But then after I sort of moved on and started doing other things, entrepreneurial things and ministry things, it was always there as a parallel track, right? I remember another story of another girl. Her name was, I'm making up a name because, this is such a sensitive subject. But this girl, I'll call her Kyla. And I think it was in North Philly, and I met Kyla, and she was just the sweetest thing. But she must have been 14, something like that, maybe younger, and she's already had 2 abortions by then. I didn't even know that was even physically possible, but that was the story. And you could tell sort of the deep scarring in her life at the time. I just remember she would have these outbursts of anger, and also she was the sweetest thing at the same time. She just wanted to be around people, loved us to death. And I remember having that impact on me, is that, there's just so much pain in this world. There's so much abuse, so much neglect, and actually just straight up evil. And some of the people that suffer from it are just the most innocent people, these children. And it changes me, right? When I had these conversations and served these people and traveled all over the world, it changed me. So I sort of stayed with that love for philanthropy forever. We, when the war in Ukraine started, I already had these gears, right? I have sort of okay, how do you organize? How do you do disaster relief? How do you mobilize? How do you raise funds? And then how do you market that? How do you spread the word? I had those 2 gears sort of ready. And when the war started, I was hearing my friends from Ukraine, and we actually lived there for a short period of time. My youngest daughter was born in Ukraine, and I have literally hundreds of friends in Ukraine. And I was on the phone with them, and they were in bomb shelters. And it was just, like your brain is exploding when you hear that. You never in your wildest dreams imagined that an invasion from a neighboring country would be even a thing. But these were my friends with their children in bomb shelters, and for days on end. And they would figure out how to evacuate. And we had, millions of cars, trying to get away from the fighting, and people run out of gas and food and medicine for the elderly. So what I did is I sort of talked to some friends, and we organized, and we set up a website by like day 6, I think, of the fighting, and we started sending money. And it was like just first very grassroots, and then we organized and become more sophisticated. We sort of started 2 nonprofit organizations, one in Lviv and one in Kiev. And but before that, it was just extremely quick responses. So we would have a network of people stuck in those massive traffic jams, and they would sort of join these WhatsApp groups, and they would say, "Hey, I need some, some medicine, a little bit of food, and some gas," and these micro donations. So we would organize them, batch them, document them, and then send a transfer to one place, and then we would distribute those by dropping it into e-wallets in people's phones, and they can make the purchase right there and then. This was months before the UN, the Red Cross were even present or be able to do anything. So we had this sort of entrepreneurial thing, quick response. And then long term, we started 2 organizations, one in Lviv, one in Kiev, and we helped the refugees in Lviv, because a lot of people went from those cities to Lviv, which is on the border with Poland, and then a bunch of people in Kiev, and eventually we sort of narrowed it down to getting sort of physical equipment, like gym equipment for therapy for the soldiers that were wounded. They had to like get their strength back and get healthy. And then kids of war. We did art therapy with kids, and then we had another initiative with a shelter for families where there were mostly single moms with kids who were evacuated, displaced because of the war. And we did that for a while, and we went there, Deb and I went there during the war, so a couple of years ago. And it was probably one of the most meaningful 2 weeks of my life. We saw things and heard things that I won't repeat here because it's going to devastate you. The inhumane treatment, the killings, the torture, the bombing, abduction of children, things like that, it's just, and what I want to share is that the most important thing for me in that chapter, which sort of distracted me from my business, I'd sort of dropped everything, was that I could not only just be heartbroken watching the news, but I could actually do something about it. And I think if more people pick one thing, you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be ultra wealthy, pick one thing where you can make a difference in one life, I think that's not optional. I think we were designed to help somebody in need, even if it's on one-on-one, right? Sponsor a child, for example, somewhere. Help a kid, mentor a kid in the inner city, change his or her worldview. So anyway, now what we're doing now, and this, I'm going to wrap up the episode with this because I'm getting a little long-winded because I get all passionate about this, is a few years ago, we started the Ascend Academy in Mozambique. So this is where I grew up. I knew it's still one of the poorest countries in the world. It's heartbreaking to even say that. But 74% of the population live on under $2.50 a day. So I think it's because of inflation. The World Bank has ticked up the boundary of extreme poverty to $2.50 a day. But it's horrible. And this country is still 74% of the population lives on beyond that line, under that line. So we have this academy. It's called the Ascend Academy, and it's very, very small. And it's basically helping kids with three things. One is character, because they'll usually lack it in extreme poor areas. There's all kinds of structures that get disrupted, parenting, families, just neighborhoods in general. So they get to hang out with people with a lot of character, professionals in their city that they can talk to, and they can see themselves in them. Go, oh, I can be that one day. English language, which makes you very employable in places like this, and computer literacy, which makes you very employable in things like this, in places like this. And the idea is to equip those kids with the character, the language, and the environment. They get a meal a day, they get uniforms, they have access to computers, which they don't have in their normal schooling. They just don't have it. And they just flourish, they just perk up, and they're transformed so quickly. It's just incredible. So that's what we're doing now. You can go to ascend, as in going up, .academy to learn more about this, and maybe you can join our effort, right? Help us sponsor a kid or 2 kids or 5 kids. It's sort of around $110 a month for the whole thing for a child. So I would love for you to come and help and join our efforts. And we actually do trips every couple of years with a group of donors, things like that. So why am I telling you all these stories? I'm telling you these stories because bad things are happening all over the world, right? In America, outside of America, Latin America, Asia. And in sort of this 24-hour news cycle, I don't think we were wired to take in so much tragedy and so much heartache and suffering. And that's why we're sort of phase it out. That's one factor. The other factor is that we live in such a prosperous place. And, even when we complain about money, it's sort of rich people problems, right, in America. And all of us have some sort of financial tension. But it's not because we're actually poor, right? It's American poor, perhaps, at worst. But we are separated by not being around people who are in that level of suffering and pain. And because we have this incredible prosperity, which is a huge blessing and just a tremendous benefit of living in this amazing country. And yet, I think it is in our cultural DNA as Americans to serve the poor, right? To be philanthropic. It's the most generous country on the planet. But individually for us, it makes a big difference in character and worldview, in this even sort of sense of, abundance, to not just focus on us in our efforts and our finances, but to focus on those who are just less fortunate. Almost like systemically, almost like a lifestyle choice, right? And I believe this is incredibly powerful for the people you're serving, but in some ways, it's more powerful for the person who is serving, because it grows you, it changes you, it transforms you. So thank you for listening to these stories that I have. I have many more, obviously, but this is just an overflow of the topic of generosity. And I've been to over 42 countries so far, and I've seen so much of this. And I see so much prosperity in America, which I'm so grateful for. And part of my heart or my mission in life is to bridge those of us who are prospering with those who are of them who are suffering, and be a presence for them, not only financially, but with friendship and character and prayers, so they know they're not alone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.